Beneath the endless skies of the western frontier, where the wind carried more sorrow than song, a boy with no last name and no place to call home stumbled into the dusty town of Mercy Ridge. His boots were too big, his coat torn at the sleeves, and his eyes held a kind of silence that only children who've lost everything can carry. 4 or 5 years, he'd wandered from ranch to ranch, sleeping in barns, working for scraps, surviving by learning to trust no one. But that changed the day the McAllister family took him in, a kind couple who offered him something he'd forgotten was possible: belonging. For the first time in his short life, the boy, whom they named Samuel, woke to the smell of cornbread instead of gunpowder. He had a bed, a place at the table, and a woman who kissed his forehead as if he were her own. The ranch became more than shelter. It became the shape of hope. Samuel began to smile again, not because life got easier, but because it finally felt safe. He cleaned the stables, learned how to ride, and at night, listened to the old man's stories by the fire. The boy who once slept with one eye open now dreamed with both eyes closed. But in the Old West, peace never comes without shadow. And deep within the folds of that warm, new life, a truth was waiting, hidden, buried, festering. Samuel didn't see it coming. He didn't notice the quiet exchanges between strangers at the general store, or the way the sheriff's gaze lingered too long on the McAllister's deeds. He thought betrayal was something loud, something that screamed before it cut. But in Mercy Ridge, it came like a whisper in the dark, wearing familiar faces, smiling kind smiles, and waiting until the boy finally let down his guard. The moment of discovery wasn't dramatic. It was simple, a letter left open, words not meant for his eyes. But once read, they could never be unseen. The McAllisters hadn't rescued Samuel by chance. He was part of a bargain, a debt owed, a bloodline long buried in scandal. He hadn't found a family. He had been placed, traded. And the warmth he had felt was not the heat of love, but the fire of secrets burning too close to the skin. The home he had trusted had been built on sand, and now it was beginning to sink. What does a boy do when the only people he's ever trusted become the reason his heart breaks all over again? In the Wild West, survival meant more than food and fire. It meant knowing who you were, even when the truth tried to rip it away. And for Samuel, that journey was just beginning. Because this isn't just a story about loss. It's about what happens when a little orphan, once given the world, realizes he must fight to keep not the land, but his own name. And that fight would change everything. Samuel didn't run that night. He could have. The wind was right, the moon high, and his old instincts still sharp. But something in him refused to leave. Not this time. He'd spent his whole life walking away from places that hurt too much to stay. But Mercy Ridge had cracked open a different part of him, the part that wanted answers more than escape. So instead of slipping through the fields and vanishing into the dark, he folded the letter, tucked it beneath his mattress, and faced the dawn with a heart that beat harder than ever before. The McAllisters noticed his silence at breakfast. He didn't speak. He barely touched the food. But he watched them, not like a boy looking at his parents, but like a stranger reading shadows. Mrs. McAllister smiled softly, touched his shoulder, and asked if he was feeling all right. Samuel nodded, but his chest ached, not from the betrayal itself, but from how normal everything looked. How two people who had shown him warmth and laughter could sit across from him, with steady eyes, and pretend nothing had changed. That day, he worked the fields with hands that trembled. Every shovel of dirt felt heavier, every breeze colder. And yet, he kept going. Because deep inside, beyond the storm of confusion and grief, a voice whispered, "You were not born to be broken again." He remembered the way Mr. McAllister had taught him to saddle a horse, the stories they'd told about the land and its roots. And now he wondered, how many of those stories were real? How much of the truth had been carved from lies? In the barn, Samuel confronted the old stallion, the one no one could ride but him. He pressed his forehead to its mane, seeking something solid, something true. The horse nuzzled him gently, unaware of the storm swirling in the boy's soul. That moment reminded him of something the widow at the chapel once said, "The land doesn't lie. Only people do." And suddenly, Samuel knew where he needed to go. If the truth had been hidden in silence, then it was time to search where silence echoed loudest. The graves, the church ledgers, the places where names were erased. That evening, while the McAllisters sat in the parlor, Samuel walked into the hills with a lantern in hand and a question in his heart. He followed no map, only memory, of where the widow said old records were kept, where bones were buried under stone with no inscription. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of answers. But he had learned that in the West, only those who face the ghosts earn the right to call anything home. And Samuel, he needed to know if the place he had loved had ever truly been his. The chapel stood crooked on the edge of town, its windows broken, its roof half-caved from a storm long past. Yet Samuel felt drawn to it, not for faith, but for memory. Inside, the floorboards groaned beneath his feet as he moved toward the back, past splintered pews and faded hymnals. Behind the pulpit, hidden beneath a torn canvas, he found what he was looking for: a ledger wrapped in oilcloth, its leather cover cracked with age. It smelled of dust, regret, and stories long buried. He lit his lantern, turned the pages with care, and searched for his name. Not Samuel, but whatever had come before. And there, halfway down a yellowed page, dated 12 years earlier, he found it. Male child, unnamed. Mother, Anna Lee Caldwell. No record of father. Delivered to Ridge Home for the Lost. The handwriting was shaky, as if the person writing it wasn't sure it was worth remembering. But Samuel stared at it, as if it were carved in stone. Anna Lee Caldwell. He whispered the name like a prayer, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. His mother had a name. That changed everything. Back at the McAllisters, he said nothing. Not yet. But he watched with new eyes. If he had been part of a debt, a quiet arrangement to erase a scandal or repay a favor, then who else had known? The sheriff? The banker who always looked at him with pity? The preacher who avoided his gaze? In the West, secrets weren't hidden under floorboards. They were worn like hats, passed from head to head until no one could remember where they started. But Samuel wasn't a secret anymore. He was a story. And stories, once awakened, have a way of demanding to be told. That night, he sat beneath the stars, the relic of the ledger page folded in his pocket, and asked the wind a question no child should have to ask. Why would someone take me and just lie to me? And the wind, in its own strange language, seemed to answer. Because some people fear truth more than loss. The moon rose higher, cold and watching. And Samuel, though small and worn, no longer felt like a boy caught in someone else's life. He was beginning to feel like something far more dangerous, a boy reclaiming his own. The days that follow were laced with silence, the kind that doesn't just fill a room, but sits between people like a wall too tall to climb. Samuel kept to his chores, his voice low, his eyes sharper than ever. He no longer asked questions, but listened. He watched how Mr. McAllister flinched whenever the word deed was mentioned at the store. He noticed how Mrs. McAllister would glance at the mail before Samuel could reach it, her hands trembling just enough to betray something deeper. The kindness was still there, but now he wondered if it had ever been real, or just a disguise for guilt. What hurt Samuel most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the possibility that he had been used to cover a debt, to save a name, to clean the shame of someone else's past. And yet, the love he'd felt hadn't been false. The laughs by the fire, the nights he fell asleep with a full belly, the way Mrs. McAllister braided his hair when he was fevered, those moments couldn't be faked. That contradiction gnawed at him. Could people do good things and still carry dark reasons behind them? Was it possible to be both a comfort and a lie? Unable to bear the weight of not knowing, Samuel finally confronted them. He waited until the sky turned violet and the house fell quiet, then stepped in the parlor with the folded ledger page in hand. His voice trembled as he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me who I was?" The room fell cold. Mrs. McAllister lowered her knitting. Mr. McAllister set down his glass. There was no denial in their eyes, only weariness. "Because we didn't want you to leave," the old man said. "And we thought, if we gave you truth, you'd take and go." Samuel looked at them, heart pounding. "But it was mine to take." Mrs. McAllister's voice cracked as she whispered, "We lost a child once. Years before you came. You smiled just like him." The truth spilled out then. How Samuel's mother had been disowned by her family. How she died alone on the edge of town. How the McAllisters had been asked to take the boy in to clean up the mess. What started as obligation turned into something else. But they had never told him. fearing that once he knew, he'd see their love as a transaction instead of something real. Samuel said nothing at first. He just stared at the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. Then he nodded slowly and walked outside. The air was sharp, the stars quiet. He didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because he had cried enough in other lives, other beds, other towns. This was different. This wasn't the grief of loss. It was the pain of clarity. And in that pain, something was born. Not rage, not vengeance, but resolve. If his life had been traded like land, he would reclaim it like a man, step by step, story by story. Samuel left at sunrise. He didn't pack much, just a page from the ledger, a blanket, a satchel of dried bread, and the name Anna Lee Caldwell folded against his chest. The McAllisters didn't stop him. They stood on the porch, older than they had seemed the day before, watching a boy they had once bathed and fed walk away like a man they no longer had the right to claim. Mrs. McAllister called out once, voice trembling, "We loved you," even if we didn't know how to do it right. Samuel didn't turn back, but he nodded once, just enough to say he'd heard. He headed east, toward the old mining town of Cinder Hollow, a place he had only heard of in whispers and warnings. According to the widow, that was where his mother had been last seen before she died. She had worked in the boarding house kitchen, barely more than a girl herself, pregnant and nameless to most. Samuel rode a borrowed horse and followed the trail through canyon and sagebrush, every mile tightening the grip of grief and anticipation around his ribs. The West had a way of making even the strongest doubt their direction, but Samuel's compass was no longer fear. It was truth. In Cinder Hollow, the past waited like smoke. The town had grown quiet over the years. The gold ran dry, and with it, the noise. But the memories were thick in the air. Samuel asked questions at the saloon, showed the name to a shopkeeper with tired eyes, offered to sweep the chapel steps for a look at old baptism records. Some turned him away. Others hesitated. But one woman, the oldest laundress in town, gasped when she saw the name. "Anna Lee," she whispered. "That girl sang like the morning. You got her eyes." She told him what the town never had, how his mother used to sit by the river and hum lullabies to her unborn child, how she was kind, even when folks were cruel, and how, in the end, she died not from sickness, but from heartbreak, waiting for someone to come back who never did. Samuel didn't ask who. He didn't want to know yet. The pain of her loss was still raw in the shape of his chest, but something shifted inside him that day. His mother hadn't been forgotten. She had lived here, loved, fought, hoped. He spent that night by the riverbank where she used to sing. The water moved like a whisper, like a voice carried from the past to the present. Samuel didn't speak. He just placed the page from the ledger into the fire and watched it curl to ash. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he had found something stronger than proof. Presence. He no longer needed permission to exist. He was no longer a borrowed boy with borrowed love. He was his mother's son, and from that night forward, he would carry her story, not as a wound, but as a weapon. Samuel returned to Mercy Ridge just as spring began to paint the horizon with soft gold. The wildflowers stretched over the hills like quiet applause, and the town, though smaller than he remembered, felt less like a cage and more like a mirror. People watched him differently now. He wasn't a stray boy anymore. He rode taller. He spoke slower. There was weight in his presence, not because he had grown older, but because he had walked through truth and come back whole. And in the West, that kind of transformation didn't go unnoticed. He didn't go straight to the McAllister ranch. Instead, he stopped by the chapel and found the widow sweeping the stone steps, same as always. When she saw him, her eyes didn't widen. She simply smiled, as if she'd known he'd return all along. "You found her, didn't you?" she asked softly. Samuel nodded. She was waiting. Even after, his voice caught. The widow placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "Grief doesn't end when the truth comes. But now you grieve with roots. That makes all the difference." That afternoon, Samuel stood once more before the graves outside the chapel. He had carved a wooden plaque with her name, Anna Lee Caldwell, and placed it beside the others with his own 2 hands. No fanfare, no speech, just one boy claiming what had been denied to him for too long, a place to mourn, and a reason to rise. The townsfolk gathered at a distance, drawn by something they didn't understand. And when they asked who she was, he answered without hesitation, "My mother." And the reason I never gave up. When he finally rode up to the McAllister gate, the sun was low, and the barn cast long shadows over the fields. Mr. McAllister was repairing the fence, his hand slower now. He looked up as Samuel approached, but didn't speak. Samuel dismounted and walked over. For a moment, the two just stood there, the silence full of memories neither of them had the strength to hold alone. Then Samuel spoke, calm but certain. "I'm not the same boy you took in." Mr. McAllister nodded. "I can see that." Samuel continued, "I'm not here to stay, but I'm not here to hate you either." That night, he sat on the porch with Mrs. McAllister. She handed him a piece of warm pie without saying a word. For the first time, they shared a silence that wasn't built on fear, but on understanding. She reached in her apron and handed him a small pouch. Inside was a silver ring. "It was hers," she said. "We were supposed to give it to you when you were ready." Samuel held it gently, heart trembling. Not because of the object, but because for the first time in his life, something that belonged to his mother finally belonged to him. With spring in full bloom and the ghosts of winter behind him, Samuel set off once more. Not because he was running, but because now he had somewhere to go. Word had spread of a new schoolhouse being built near Dry Creek, and they were looking for someone to help with the young boys, someone who understood what it meant to be lost and what it meant to be found. Samuel never imagined he'd teach, but maybe he wouldn't teach in the usual way. Maybe he'd teach the way the West had taught him, through scars, through silence, and through the stories others try to bury. As he rode, he carried more than just supplies in a saddlebag. He carried that ring, wrapped in cloth. He carried a new name, Samuel Caldwell. Etched into a small journal, he kept it aside. And most of all, he carried the lesson he had bled to learn, that no home built on lies could truly shelter you, but no truth spoken in love could ever be destroyed. He wasn't chasing a future now. He was building one, plank by plank, in honor of a mother who had sung to the river and never been heard. Until now. At Dry Creek, he found the beginnings of something beautiful. A handful of children, some barefoot, some bruised by life already, but all with eyes that still held wonder. When they asked who he was, he smiled and said, "Someone who didn't have a home, until I made one." The other men built walls and laid stone. Samuel built trust. He didn't speak much at first, but when he told stories, the children leaned in, because his voice carried something they'd never heard before, truth wrapped in tenderness. Over time, people stopped calling him the orphan boy. They started calling him Teacher Sam, and when he sat alone some nights, staring at the moon just as his mother once had, he didn't feel empty anymore. He felt connected, not to a bloodline or a house, but to a purpose. He was proof that the West could be cruel, but it could also be corrected, that the land could wound, but it could also welcome back, and that even a boy forgotten by history could carve his own name into the bones of time. Samuel Caldwell never forgot Mercy Ridge, nor did he hate it. He returned once a year, to tend his mother's grave, to share a quiet meal with the McAllisters, and to remind himself of how far he had come. Because his story wasn't about vengeance. It was about vindication. And in the Old West, there was no justice greater than a boy who was once treated like a secret, growing into a man no one could forget. Samuel's visits to Mercy Ridge became a ritual, quiet, personal, sacred. Each spring, he rode alone through the hills with the same horse, the same saddle, and a small bouquet of wildflowers tucked into his satchel. The chapel had been repaired over time, not by order, but by the hands of those who remembered. The headstone he'd carved for Anna, Lee Caldwell, stood firm now, polished by sun and rain, and around it grew bluebonnets that only ever seemed to bloom in that one corner of the field. He'd kneel, place the flowers, and sit for a while. He didn't need to say much. She was always listening. One particular visit, several years later, felt different. The town had changed. A new general store had opened, the saloon had quieted, and the old sheriff had retired. But the weight Samuel carried that year wasn't just nostalgia, it was grief. A boy from Dry Creek, one he had mentored and fed and protected, had been buried weeks earlier after falling ill. His name was Caleb, and he had reminded Samuel too much of himself, all stubbornness and fire, always pretending he didn't need anyone, until he did. Samuel had done all he could, But in the end, even good men can't stop everything. Sitting beside his mother's grave, Samuel whispered, "I couldn't save him." And for the first time in years, he felt that same ache, the one he thought he'd buried back when he first found her name. But then he remembered what the widow once told him. Some stories don't end where we want them to. But if we carry them right, they don't really end at all. Caleb's story, like Annalee's, would live on, in the way Samuel taught the other children to speak with gentleness, in the way he never let another boy sleep cold under the sky, in the way he forgave himself, slowly. As he left the chapel, he passed the McAllister ranch. The house looked smaller now. Tom had softened it. Mr. McAllister, cane in hand, sat on the porch with a blanket across his knees. Samuel tipped his hat. The old man raised his in return, no words spoken. They didn't need them. Samuel had found peace with what had happened, not by erasing the past, but by allowing it to grow into something else. Some wounds don't close the way we hope. They become part of us, not as pain, but as proof that we survived and chose to heal. And that, Samuel understood now, was the true mark of a man in the West. Not how many battles he won, not how fast he could draw, but how deeply he was willing to feel and still remain kind. Mercy Ridge had once broken him. Now it welcomed him like a chapter he had finally finished reading, one that no longer haunted, but humbled. And as he rode away that day, the wind behind him wasn't cold. It was warm, familiar, like a whisper from a voice long gone, saying, "You did right, son. You did just fine." Back in Dry Creek, the schoolhouse had grown. What began as a single room with a dozen chairs now had 2 buildings, a garden, and a community that looked after its own. Samuel had helped build every inch of it, not just with hammer and nail, but with intention. Every child who stepped inside those walls was taught not just arithmetic or reading, but how to sit with silence, how to honor pain, how to name their fears and still move forward. These lessons weren't written on any blackboard. They lived in the way Samuel looked them in the eyes and listened. He kept a small book on his desk, a ledger of names, not unlike the one that had once told his story in Mercy Ridge. But this one was different. It held the names of every orphan, every wanderer, every misfit who found a home in Dry Creek. Their birthdays, their favorite colors, what made them laugh, and what made them cry. He refused to let any of them become a line on a forgotten page. He had been that once, unnamed, unloved, unnoticed. Not anymore. Not for them. One stormy night, a teenage girl arrived at the door soaked and shivering, holding nothing but a torn satchel and the name of the man who helps kids who don't belong anywhere. Samuel welcomed her in, wrapped her in a blanket, and simply asked, "Do you want to rest first, or talk first?" She looked up, startled, then nodded. "Rest." He led her to the cot near the fire, and as she curled up, he saw something in her eyes he recognized, that flicker of disbelief that someone cared without wanting anything back. It was the same look he must have had when the McAllisters first opened their door. Later that week, she told him her story, one of abandonment, shame, and betrayal. Samuel didn't flinch. He never did. He only said, "This town doesn't erase your past, but will help you build a future that doesn't look like it." The girl cried, not out of sorrow, but because someone had finally spoken to her like she mattered. And that's when Samuel knew. The West hadn't tamed him, nor had it broken him. It had transformed him into a keeper of stories, a protector of memory, and a guardian for those the world tried to forget. The legend of Samuel Caldwell began to spread, not in saloons or wanted posters, but around campfires and across dinner tables. Parents told their children about the man who once had no name, who rose from betrayal not with a gun, but with grace. And in that, Samuel became something rare in the Old West. Not feared, not famous, but followed. Because in a place where most men left behind only dust, he left behind something far more powerful, belonging. The orphan's quiet presence became a beacon for others who had known loss. He helped around the ranch with a diligence that mirrored gratitude, not obligation. Every seed he planted, every animal he tended to, carried the weight of someone trying to rebuild trust in humanity. His days were long and silent, but he never once complained. In his heart, he still held onto the memory of the night he was betrayed, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Old Wade noticed the boy's strength, but also saw the sorrow he never voiced. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, Wade sat beside him and asked no questions. He only offered an ear. That was when the boy finally spoke about the fire, the stolen letter, and the secret that had turned his world upside down. It was not a confession of anger, but a quiet reflection, soaked in pain and yearning. Wade listened without interrupting once. That night, Wade visited the sheriff. He handed over a small pouch of coins and a note written by his late wife. Inside it was a simple message. If this boy ever finds his way here, protect him as you would our own. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. He'd never known Wade had considered adopting anyone, much less prepared for it in writing. Wade simply nodded and said, "She saw something I didn't." Until now. The next morning, Wade built a wooden plaque and placed it on the porch. It read only one word: home. The boy, barefoot and dusty from the field, stared at it for a long moment. Something in him shifted. Not quite joy, but a steady warmth he hadn't felt since he was 5. This wasn't just a temporary bed or borrowed kindness. This was belonging, forged through pain, humility, and earned trust. And yet, even in that peace, a shadow still lingered. He hadn't seen the man who betrayed him since that night. He didn't know where he was, or if he ever would return. But the boy had changed. He was no longer running. He was ready, not for revenge, but for understanding, for closure. Because some ghosts aren't meant to be hunted. Some are meant to be faced with eyes wide open and heart unguarded. Weeks passed. The boy grew into the rhythm of ranch life, his muscles tougher, his spirit calmer. But one autumn morning, as he fed the horses, a figure appeared at the gate. It was the man, his mother's old friend, the one who took everything. His clothes were ragged, his eyes hollowed out by guilt and distance. He didn't speak, just stood, clutching a worn leather hat in his hands. Wade approached slowly, his rifle on his back, but his stance was measured. The boy didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked right up to the man and looked him in the eye. The wind stilled. "Why?" he asked. The man trembled. "Because I was weak. Because I thought I could erase my own pain by burying someone else's future." The honesty cut sharper than any blade. Instead of rage, the boy simply nodded. "I lost everything because of you," he said. "But I found more here than you ever took from me." The man's eyes filled with tears, and he dropped to his knees. Wade didn't speak. The boy didn't need his protection now. He had become someone who could choose mercy without forgetting the truth. They didn't welcome the man inside. Not yet. But they didn't send him away either. Wade offered him a day's work if he wanted it. The man nodded. And so, the sun rose over a ranch where forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was alive, pulsing between every sunrise and sunset, stitched into the fields, the sweat, and the silence. That little orphan had found a home. But more than that, he had become a part of something greater than revenge or justice. He had become the keeper of a new legacy, one where pain was not erased, but transformed, one where betrayal didn't end a story, but deepened it. And in the quiet of that prairie land, a boy once lost had finally learned what it meant to be whole. As the dust settled over the quiet plains, what remained wasn't just the memory of a small orphan's fleeting joy, but a timeless lesson carved deep into the heart of every soul who ever dared to love. His brief glimpse of family, shattered by betrayal, revealed something far more enduring than shelter or affection. It showed the raw truth of what it means to belong, to trust, and to lose. In the unforgiving world of the West, bonds are not formed by blood alone, but by sacrifice. And that little boy gave more of himself than most men ever would. His story reminds us that even the warmest embrace can hide a blade, yet love, real love, still finds a way to survive. Though he was left with scars no child should bear, he walked forward with eyes wide open, a spirit shaped not by bitterness, but by quiet strength. The West never promised fairness, only that a man, or a child, would be measured by what he carried in his heart when the storm came. And he carried courage. The echo of his pain lingers like a whisper in the wind. Every kind gesture he once believed in now sits like ash in his memory. But still, he did not curse the sky or close his heart to what might come next. Instead, he became a warning and a beacon, a living memory of how fragile trust can be and how sacred it is when found. For every viewer who has tasted betrayal or walked alone in a world too vast to understand, his footsteps are yours. Let this not be just a story of loss, but a call to protect what is good, to choose honesty even when it's hard, and to never forget the cost of silence when betrayal knocks. Somewhere out there, another little soul may be searching for a home, and what you do next could be the difference between salvation and sorrow. In the Old West, everyone carried a past, but only the brave chose to turn theirs into purpose. If this story touched something deep within you, take a moment to reflect, then share your thoughts below. Let your voice be part of this journey. And if you want to walk beside more tales like this, filled with heart, grit, and truth, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. In a world full of noise, stories like these deserve to be heard.